Before we begin talking about human development, we need to start at the beginning, the biological beginning, thinking about how genes get expressed. So a fun fact, did you realize that humans are almost entirely genetically identical? There's 0.1% of our genetic makeup that differs between human beings. So it's amazing what a small difference can lead to so much variety. So as we begin talking about genes, we want to start at the beginning. A genome is really the code for making a human being. A genome is an organism's complete set of genetic instructions, essentially all of its DNA, containing all the information needed to build, develop, and maintain it. Within the genome, we have the DNA, the molecule that contains the chemical instructions for cells to manufacture various proteins. It's a complex molecule that contains genetic information. Chromosomes are molecules of the DNA that contain instructions to make proteins. Humans have 46 chromosomes, 23 pairs. And when we talk about genes, these are units of hereditary information that are composed of short segments of DNA. So when we think about the beginnings of life, development begins at conception. Each human reproductive cell or gamete contains 23 chromosomes, half of that person's 46 chromosomes total. A gamete is a reproductive cell, so it's either a sperm cell or an ovum that can produce the new individual if it combines with a gamete from the other sex to make a zygote. So a zygote is a single cell that's formed through fertilization from the fusing of two gametes, a sperm and an ovum. It's important to distinguish between genotypes and phenotypes. A genotype is an individual's genetic heritage, the actual genetic material, their DNA. But genotypes just give us a blueprint for potential characteristics. So if we were geneticists and we could look at people's DNA, they would tell us what we might be predisposed to or give us some indication of what that person might be like, but they won't actually tell us exactly what that person is like. That is more about the phenotype. So the phenotype is the way an individual's genotype is actually expressed in observable and measurable characteristics. So like physical characteristics, psychological characteristics. So for instance, we might have identical twins who have identical DNA, but one might be half an inch taller than the other. Even though they have the same genotype, their phenotype might be slightly different. So for each genotype, there's a reaction range of phenotypes that can be expressed. And so this reaction range is just the range of possible phenotypes for each genotype. And what ends up becoming important is the environment's restrictiveness or richness. So if we have identical DNA, identical genotypes, the environment is going to play a role in how tall we end up being, or how quickly we're able to read, all of these other factors. Even if we think about weight, right? So our genotype might predispose us to be relatively slender, but if we live in an environment with only very high processed foods and encouragement to eat a lot and maybe not move our body, we might push that expression of the genotype to its higher limit, where we might have a higher body weight compared to someone who might have identical genotype but might be raised in an environment where healthy food and healthy activity levels are encouraged. They might have a slightly different expression of that genotype. Another way of thinking about the interaction between genes and environment is where we typically are talking about how our environment influences the expression of our genes, like we just did with phenotypes and genotypes, right? So better nutrition can help us reach maximum height allowed by our genes, for instance. But it also goes the other way. Genes can also influence the types of environments to which we're exposed. And Sandra Scar, who's a behavior geneticist, she described 3 different ways that genes and environment can be related. She talked about passively, evocatively, and actively. And as we go through these and give some examples, you'll see that these vary in how salient they are across the lifespan. So our first one, passive gene-environment interaction. This tends to occur when biological parents provide a rearing environment that matches their own genetic tendencies, and their child inherits those genetic tendencies. So in this case, it's going to be important that we're talking about biological parents rather than adopted parents who are of no relation to the child, because the idea is that the biological parent is sharing genetic material with the child, right? So they both have similar genes. And if a biological parent is choosing an environment that matches their own genetic tendencies, and their child has similar genetic tendencies, then that child is passively going to be influenced by that. So an example might be parents who are genetically intelligent and skillful readers might provide an environment to raise their children where there's lots of books to read and where they read to their child as they're growing up, and they're encouraged to spend time reading and to choose books that they might be interested in. And so in this way, their environment that the child is being raised in does match their own genetic tendencies, but it's mostly because in a passive way, because their parents, their biological parents, are providing this environment. So this is more likely to happen when you're a younger age, earlier in the lifespan, because your biological parents are more likely to have control over that environment. Whereas when you get older, you're more likely to take more of an active role in choosing your own environments. Our second type is evocative gene-environment interaction. So this occurs when an individual's genotype elicits certain types of physical and social environments. So evocative meaning like it elicits, it evokes certain responses from others. So some examples. A child who genetically is very social and active and happy and smiling might receive more social stimulation than passive, quiet children. When my kids were young, they, especially my daughter, would wave at everyone in the supermarket and smile and wave, and everyone would smile and wave back to her and stop and talk to her when she was a toddler. But if you had a more quiet, shy child that wasn't interacting, they would have a different experience in that supermarket. Another example would be an athletically inclined youth is going to tend to elicit encouragement to engage in school sports, right? So if you have a 6-foot-tall 8th grader, they're probably going to get some attention from the basketball coach to encourage them to try out for the basketball team. And so in this way, we can see that their genetics are encouraging or eliciting a type of response from others just based on what their genes are. This can happen really throughout the whole lifespan. So it can occur in childhood, but it also can continue to occur in adulthood as well. Our third type and last type is active or niche picking gene-environment interaction. This occurs when individuals seek out environments that they find compatible and stimulating to their genetic tendencies. So niche picking is this idea of finding a setting that's well suited to your abilities. So for instance, we might have a teenager who's musically inclined, and they're going to actively select out musical environments where they can successfully show their skills, right? So if they have, an ear for music, they might choose to be in choir or orchestra or band when they have the choice in school. And so in this case, we're going to see this less with very, very young children, but as we get into middle childhood and adolescence and then adulthood, where these individuals get to choose their environments more and they have more control over their environments, they're going to be more likely to choose those environments. And you can see, we can take that same example of that teenager, that 8th grader who was 6 feet tall. Maybe that 8th grader was encouraged to try out basketball by the coach just because they realized how tall they were. But then as they get older, they might actively choose to continue to play basketball or continue to play some other sport where their height or some other genetic physical ability allowed them to be successful. So these are Sandor-Scar's 3 different types of gene-environment interactions where we're actually seeing the genes impacting the environment, which is the opposite of how we often talk about environment impacting genes. So it can really go both ways.